Welcome to the Lovers Lounge podcast, where we talk to experts and other guests on topics related to love, relationships, and sex. I'm your host, Tina Love, and on this episode, we have Sarah Hunter Murray. Sarah earned her PhD in human sexuality from the University of Guelph. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, in the Department of Family Relations and Applied Nutrition, and she's become a leading expert on men and women's sexual desire in long term relationships. Now, she's researched what turns us on when we want sex and when and why we don't, and the biggest misconceptions we have about men and women's sexuality, and what the rest of us can learn from the most sexually satisfied couples. Sarah is a regularly sought out sex expert for media outlets such as Today's Parent, Cosmopolitan, and Huffington Post. And she is the author of the book, Not Always in the Mood: The New Science of Men, Sex, and Relationships. Welcome, Sarah, to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yes, I tell you, I've been following you and looking at some of your videos on YouTube, and then listening to some podcasts that you were on previously. And I am just very interested in talking with you here on the Lovers Lounge. So thank you for coming on.
That's awesome.
Yep. All right. So before we dig in into your book, I want to first find out what led you to this type of work. You've done a lot.
Yeah, so I've always kind of been interested in our relationship with sex. It's something that so many of us do at some point in our lives, and yet it has this either forbiddenness, like we don't talk about it, hush hush, or it's kind of in your faces, like on billboards and advertising, and this kind of, women in scantily clad clothes or sexually suggestive, positions. In order to have, it just seems so important to me to have like a real, authentic, honest conversation about sex, to normalize it, to talk about, what we're doing right, what couples are doing when they're dissatisfied, how we can kind of improve our sex lives. It just seemed like we needed to have a more matter of fact conversation about that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm drawn to the sciences. I'm drawn to the social sciences. And so having actual data, being able to collect things, be able to tell, here's patterning, here's statistically significant findings, kind of grounding all this stuff, that we have all these ideas about sex and grounding it in real data. I thought, graduate studies studying sex, I thought there could be a better path forward for me.
Wow. I bet you found out a lot. And I'm so interested in having you share all of your, well, not all of your information, because you couldn't possibly do all of that on this show, but definitely some of the things that you've learned. So I'm really, really excited. I've noticed that there's a lot of different reactions to your book. I mean, I think there was a talk show where a gentleman was saying, well, she didn't talk to me because I, want to have sex all the time and all this kind of stuff. And so what has been some of your, the reactions from men and or women about your book and some of the things that you found? Men maybe not necessarily
Yeah.
always in the mood. What did you find, or what have you found?
Right. So there's been a lot of different reactions, and to kind of continue the question you asked earlier about how I got into this. I mean, I guess I kind of addressed how I got into the study of sex generally, but one of the things that people react to, that I'll just address off the hop, is I am a cisgendered woman, born female, identify as woman, and so sometimes people kind of respond. How did you start studying men's sexual desire? And what do you really know? And are men really being open and honest with you?
Right, right.
Um, what I'd like to start by saying is, I got into study sexual desire in general. I actually started by studying women's sexual desire. As a woman, I was most interested in that. I was kind of curious about things that like me and my girlfriends might talk about. Women's sexual desire is kind of considered complex, somewhat elusive. This idea of like, honey, not tonight, I've got a headache, is something that we kind of only attribute to women's experiences. And it was only through the course of studying the complexities of women's sexual desire that I started to notice that as researchers, as lay people, we were just kind of assuming that men were always in the mood, that
Mm-hmm.
men always wanted to have sex, that it was always on their brain, kind of top priority. There was never a time that they were going to turn down a sexual opportunity. And as I started to kind of like go further and further down the road studying women's sexual desire, it just seems like more and more like confronting. I was like, that's a big assumption. And more I would talk with, girlfriends saying, my husband would kind of like, somewhat, I'll use in quotations, kind of brag, about always being in the mood. But she would say, well, he turned me down last night. So like
Mm-hmm.
those two things aren't adding up.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought, you know what, I'm going to do a little bit more digging. I'm going to see what's really going on. I'm going to see how true is this stereotype. Like, let's actually talk to some men. Let's get some interviews going. Let's get some hard facts and let's see how true is this stereotype.
Yeah, I'm really
So,
glad that you did.
in,
Yeah, I'm just gonna say I'm really glad
mhm,
that you did because, in my doing this show and listening to, because I've interviewed people on women's desire and lack of desire, and as I would listen to them talk about women, I would think to myself, man, if this is how women feel, then I can only imagine if there's a man who really doesn't feel like having sex, the pressure on him to possibly maybe act like he does because of the whole idea or thought that society has that men are just always in the mood. So I'm really glad that you
exactly.
did this study because it was always something in the back of my mind as a curiosity of wondering. I
Hmm.
wonder how, is this really true? I'm wondering if indeed men aren't always in the mood and what are the statistics? What's the what research says about it? So I'm really glad and we're going to
Hmm.
uncover all of this. This is so very exciting. But anyway, so this is what led you to sort of deciding then to write the book. Is that correct?
Exactly, exactly. So this was part of my graduate research. I continued my research after graduating in order to write the book. But you kind of asked around, like people's reactions, and it's across the board. The most common response I get is like from the women's side of things is, oh my gosh, like I am confronting some of my own biases. It's helping me understand my male partner better. The most common response I get from men, which it's interesting because I find that men email me privately, like women are a bit
Yes.
more public about it. They might share something on Twitter,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, something like that. But men are more likely to email, say, you know what, I finally feel seen. I finally feel heard. This is me. This represents my experience. This is kind of a breath of fresh air to realize that other men are like me. So
Yeah.
those are some of the two of the most common responses I get. But as you alluded to, there's certainly men out there who say, along the lines of, of what you kind of quoted earlier, she didn't talk to me. That's not my experience. I'll take sex anytime I can get it.
Yeah, exactly.
And what I'll say is, you know, men are, there's variation, there's complexities with women. We don't all fit into one tidy box. Um, but what I think is important to acknowledge is we all, and I say that pretty confidently, I don't think that's too much of an exaggeration. I think we all have heard or know or are familiar with the stereotype that men want sex all the time, that their sex drive is
Mhm.
high, constant, unwavering, always in the mood. And so, if that fits for you and if that works, great, right? There's nothing wrong with having a high sex drive. There's nothing wrong with liking sex. There's nothing wrong with wanting sex at a high frequency. However, what we don't hear enough about is all the exceptions to the rule, nor the emotional sides of men's sexual desire. So my book is not only talking about when men don't want sex. It's not simply about low sexual desire. It's addressing a lot of stereotypes or confronting a lot of stereotypes we have about men's desire, talking about the emotional pieces, what it's like when men get rejected
Mhm.
sexually, what happens to their desire, um, you know, men's desire to feel desired and not just be the pursuer and initiator of sex. So I confront a lot of stereotypes. It's not just about how high or low men's sexual desire is, because we really do know that there is quite a variety across the board.
Right. And when I heard the gentleman on the talk show, I think it was with Lonnie Love. I'm not sure. I can't remember what show it was, but when the gentleman said, "Oh, well, she didn't talk to me," and I thought to myself, quite honestly, if he really didn't always want to do this, he probably would not have said that on the show anyway. You see what I'm saying? So it was just
Yeah.
really, it was like, well,
Hmm.
yeah, you say that right now, because I think Lonnie turned around to him and said, uh, you know, are you? not in the mood sometimes. And he's like, no, she didn't talk to me. But I thought to myself, you know what? If he wasn't, he probably wasn't going to say that anyways, because there's a lot
Hmm.
of, just like you said, the men coming to you and sharing with you sort of in confidence, thanking you for doing this because it's 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 embarrassing to some of them, I think, or there's pressure that I can't possibly admit this. I mean, you even said in one of your podcasts that some men were like, I can't admit this to my guy friends, you know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, there is that idea, and I think a lot of men are quite aware that there is this expectation, like not just a stereotype, but an expectation that their
Hmm.
desire is high.
Right.
It's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? Men are kind of, put down if they've got this really high sex drive. Sometimes, like it can be considered, getting into like power dynamics and getting into, even as far as sexual abuse. Like there's a lot of, sex addiction, and that those are all topics for other podcasts, um, but there's kind of this like negative stereotype we have about men when they have a really high sex drive, and then
Right.
also we simultaneously blame them or judge them if they don't have a high
Isn't
sex
that
drive. And it's
something,
kind of what
man?
I'm hearing from men is like, what's the right amount of desire to have here?
Right.
What's the appropriate amount to show? But the idea that men are supposed to have this high sex drive, men talked about their own internalization of that. I feel like I should. They talk about how there's that idea with their friends, like, would it be okay to admit that I don't? Would it be
Yeah.
okay to admit the softer parts of myself? Touching on these, themes of masculinity. And then also talk not just about their friends and themselves and culture, but they also worry about what their female partner would think
Right.
if they weren't interested or if they turned sex down.
Yep.
And again, like, men might say, here and there, but if they're like kind of regularly not in the mood, that starts becoming like more of a complicated thing for them to navigate in their relationship.
Yes.
Um, and on that note, when I say, female partners or women partners, the men in my research were in heterosexual relationships. So I just want to give that
Yeah.
context. I don't think the findings necessarily would only apply to heterosexual men, but I was really, really interested in starting out this research with how men and women interact because the social norms and gender norms that we receive continue to be quite different.
Yeah.
And I was really, really intrigued by what happens when we interact with one another.
Okay.
Future research is going to kind of expand on that and see if these findings hold with
Okay.
men who identify as gay, bisexual, and trans, queer, and kind of going into more of the nuances. But when I talk about relationships through the course of this conversation, I'll be mostly talking about men and
Heterosexual.
women when
Okay.
they are in
All right.
relationships with one another.
Yep, no problem. So I was gonna go there next on your
Okay.
sample or the demographic and the sampling of men that you talk to. So can you go into this? This is
Hmm.
the research that you did to do the book, to write the book. So
Yeah.
you began to
Yeah.
speak with men. So what was your demographic of men? How old were they? Ethnicity? Like how many? All that kind of stuff.
Okay. So for my book, I pulled on a few different uh, points of data collection. So for my dissertation, I started with a smaller and qualitative study, far smaller, of 30 men. So I started by just kind of, let's just start exploring in-depth interviews, hour and a half. These number between 30 and 65. They were all in longer term relationships.
Hmm.
There was some diversity in ethnicity, but largely Caucasian. I'm from Canada, and I was in recruiting in Winnipeg and Saskatoon, which are both prairie towns. The demographic tends to be highly Caucasian. There was some Indigenous populations also included. Um, that was kind of step one. Step two was seeing, does this apply to the findings that I find apply to a larger sample? And I was also curious about being a woman interviewing face to face with men.
Right.
Some of the things that I've heard from people, like what are men telling you? Are they going to be honest with you? Do they
Right.
want to tell you kind of softer parts because you're a woman? Would they say something different to a man? All fair questions, with somewhat unclear answers. But what I thought to do for the second part of the data collection that really drove the book was to go online and so give men anonymity. There was no face to face. They could write whatever they wanted. I'd have no way to attach their responses to them. And then just to kind of make sure that the answers were as honest as possible. That study included over 300 men, depending on how some men answered more questions than others. But that was 300 men between the ages of 18 and 65. Both kind of hovered on average age between 30 and 40. The long-term relationships, on average, again, we're talking about kind of 7 or 8 years. They're all heterosexual, and again, largely Caucasian, majority being Caucasian.
Okay.
I do also, I mean, I had very specific questions that I asked throughout these, like, in-person online interviews, but I'm also a registered marriage and family therapist. And so I was pulling from my clinical experience. I did my PhD in human sexuality, so I did a lot of research to even start my study. So I'm pulling on my previous publications and other research that's been done in the field, albeit at the time there wasn't a whole lot. So I kind of use all of those points of data collection to present in this book.
Right. So I guess I'm kind of as I was really listening to how you were able to get the answers. So it sounds like some of them you were face to face, but then some of them you did online and they could write their responses. Is that correct?
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay. So because I'm asking that and saying that to say I'm kind of like them, some of the people that you said to you that they were surprised that you were able to get the men to really open up to you and be truthful and honest with you because you are a woman that they're talking to. And maybe there was a tendency
Hmm.
for the man to want to feel, like, I got to say this because this is a woman asking me. I need to be a little macho here. But so how do you think that you were able to really get their truthful and honest thoughts about this?
Yeah, I mean, I I think those, we always have to kind of consider, desirability bias, so how we kind of come across when
Yeah.
we're participating in research, gender dynamics, power dynamics. There's always questions in terms of, would you have a different answer if, there was a man answering? Would there be a different answer, depending
Hmm.
on,
Hmm.
I don't know, with age or where you interviewed? Those are all completely fair and legitimate questions. I do feel, from my experience, that men were giving honest answers. I mean, I have conversations with people in my clinical practice all the time as well. I like to think that my training has allowed me to
Yeah.
have, a non-judgmental conversation. I left it open for anything is normal. Let's just hear what you have to say. Um, I asked men towards the end of my face-to-face interviews because I could, about their decision to be interviewed by a woman, what it was like, if they think hypothetically that they might have said anything different if they were talking to a man. And most of the men that I talked to said that they actually participated in the study because I was a woman.
Oh,
They
good.
felt more
Okay.
comfortable that way. They felt that they wouldn't play into
The whole,
stereotypes, that
yeah.
if they were interviewed by a man, they actually might have played up that bravado side and kind of been a little bit more like
Hmm.
stereotypical locker room
Right.
side of their sexuality. Um, so again, I'm taking these men at their words
Yeah.
when they say that they're being honest, that they're being open. I mean, I think we all kind of have that little sensor of like what's going on here,
Right.
and
Right. It's
I
okay.
really felt like that we were getting real meaningful responses.
Yep.
And
That's
then,
good.
like I said, um, the online data allows for complete anonymity. So I mean, someone could write anything they wanted.
Yep.
I want sex all the time. What's wrong with you and your questions? And I wouldn't know who they are. So that could have happened, but it
Yes.
didn't.
Yes. Yes. Now, you did talk about sort of how you were able to navigate the discussion or the questions, and that some men gave you responses in the very beginning, like, oh yes, I am, I'm, wanting to, but then as you continued in your questioning, then they started to really uncover perhaps times when maybe they're not always in the mood. So, can you explain some of that and how that worked out?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
So, and whether that's in my clinical practice or when it's been with interviews during research, it is a fairly consistent pattern of the first time asking the question of, are there ever times that your desire is lower? Are there ever times that you might say no to sex or you wouldn't be interested? um, that men would either kind of start by saying either no, like I've got a very high sex drive, or anytime she wants it, I'm interested. Um, but it seems that, by giving space, by asking a follow up question, by just kind of saying, oh, is that true? Or, there's never a time that men would start to open up and say things like, oh, well, like if I'm tired or if it's been a really long day or if I'm sick, then maybe I would say no.
Hmm.
I'm like, okay, well, let's talk about that. When might you be tired? Oh, like my work is really stressful, and we've got 3 kids at home, and it's a lot to take care of them. And sometimes I'm just so focused on being a father, it's hard to kind of shift into sex like a sexy headspace by the end of the night. I was like, okay, so let's talk about fatherhood and stresses and, and all these things and how that impacts your sexual desire. And, it wouldn't take too long to kind of get these more
Yeah.
nuanced stories about like, oh, okay, so we're talking about you saying no to sex. We're talking about when your desire is less high. We're talking about times where your wife might be in the mood or your girlfriend might be in the mood and you've had a very different day and you're not. And you have to navigate that. You either have to say no or you're talking yourself into having sex, even though your desire isn't really there because you don't want to disappoint her. You don't want to, maybe disappoint yourself on some level. Um, but I thought it was really fascinating that the most common starting point still kind of played into the
Mm-hmm.
stereotypes that we're more familiar with hearing. But by giving men space to keep talking, to
Yeah.
give space to kind of like just ask that one more time, like, oh, okay, like, I'm kind of hearing you say that you said no this time, like what was going on there. Just extending the conversation a little bit. I was amazed by how much would come out by the end of these
Oh,
conversations.
yeah.
And I'm still struck with that in my clinical practice. The amount of times that, men can say, not everyone, in all fairness, result in my book, I do kind of attract a new demographic of men who want to talk about more of the other parts of their sexuality, the times they don't want sex or, them having a low sex drive. Um, but it's still very common to kind of hear that, like in the clinical setting for, she's saying like, I don't really feel like sex right now. He's saying I want sex all the time. And as we talk over a few sessions to realize, whoa, there's tons of times where she's actually really interested in having sex. And lots of times it sounds like you're saying no or aren't so interested. What's going on there?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm always listening for the exception to the rule. I'm always listening for that because I mean, my biggest premise here is men are not robots. They're not just like
That's
on,
right.
on.
That's right.
And so why would that happen when it comes to sex? Like
Yep.
you can still have a high sex drive. You can have a healthy sex drive, but that doesn't mean you need to want it all the time. And it doesn't mean that you might not need certain emotional needs and relationship pieces
Mm-hmm.
filled in order to want sex.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so, one of the things that really stands out to me was needing an emotional connection. When men, one of the examples men said for not wanting sex wasn't about their sex drive. They could still have a sex drive, but if they were having a fight with their partner, if they were like, things are not right, we're feeling distant, we're feeling disconnected,
Mm-hmm.
choosing to have sex, actually embracing their desire and letting it kind of, simmer and maybe even flourish was something they just like turned off because it wasn't appealing to have sex with a partner that they weren't getting along with.
Right.
So again, those are the kinds of examples that I think are really important to pull out from this.
Yes.
It's not necessarily as simple as saying, are you in the mood or not? Or do you have a sex drive or do you not, right? It's saying, when is it a bit lower and what do you need in order to feel more of it? And the amount of it that was kind of emotional and relational in nature, I think is really important for us to be having discussions about and
Yeah.
acknowledging on a broader
Yeah.
scale.
As I was listening to, researching and preparing to talk with you today. And so as I was listening to you and what you found, I was just like, man, this is so totally opposite of what, I've always thought or even read, about men. Like all it takes is just, they're ready. And I thought to myself, well,
Mm-hmm.
shame on me and others anyway, to think that men are just like some kind of robot. They just, push a button and boom, they're just ready. That's not necessarily the case
Yeah.
based on your study. So I was just kind of, man, it's taken something to really step back and relearn and retrain your brain to thinking something different than you've always
Mm-hmm.
really thought and challenging that. And like, well, why did you think that? And why can they not be, that way or
Right.
whatever? Yeah.
And and to your point about shame on me, and I understand maybe you're being a little like it's just a kind of a saying, but what I really like to stress here is it's nobody's fault directly, right? I never want women to feel like, oh, I've been so hard on my husband, or men to feel like, oh, I should have given more space to this, I should have been more open about this. Like I think it's always good to question, but these norms are happening at such a cultural, social level. Like they're so infiltrated. Like, of course we believe them.
Mm-hmm.
It's not for each individual to say, what was wrong with me? It's like, well, what's wrong with the societal norms that we're promoting? What's wrong with the ways that, media presents, our sexuality?
Yeah.
As men as sex crazed and women as the ones, the gatekeepers saying no. Like, what's happening in sex ed classes when we're talking about women being, you say no to men's sexual advances and you have to protect yourself and not telling men anything about, you know, how to understand their emotions and their sexuality in the softer ways. This is happening on so many layers,
Right.
and so it does need some active confronting. But I always say, if someone's kind of being hard on themselves or wondering if they've been hard on their partners, um, it's pretty understandable why we hold these beliefs in the first place.
Right. Right. Okay.
But like to your point, to start questioning them and say, why
Yeah.
do we hold them, and is
Yep.
that really true? I think is
Yep.
the key piece here in moving the conversation forward.
Absolutely. So what you found in some of the responses, I heard you say, I'm tired, working, maybe not feeling connected that particular time, as to reasons why they were not in the mood. Were there any other trends or responses that you heard from men that had a
Yeah,
bearing? Yeah.
yeah. So, one of the ones that happens pretty frequently, and one of the ones that kind of has stood out with to me the most over the course of this experience has been when men talk about their experience of sexual rejection at earlier points in the relationship and how that's come to affect them, their sexual desire, but also their self-esteem. It's a really, really common pattern, I think, that shows up. It doesn't necessarily mean that he's got high desire and she has low desire. There could be any number of reasons that her desire has ebbed and flowed, after having a child, for example, maybe a period of high stress, maybe a, mental health issue. There's lots of reasons, but if she's kind of pulling away, not interested in sex, saying no frequently, men would talk about how, sex wasn't just a way to, to experience physical release, to,
Mm-hmm.
kind of quote unquote, like get off,
Right. Right.
that they were really reaching out to feel connected. They wanted to touch their partner. They wanted to connect in that way. They wanted to feel love. They wanted to show love. And so when those efforts were being thwarted over and over again, like we all have the right to say no, of course, but I'm talking about patterns kind of starting to develop. Men talk about how, their own interest, I think, is an adaptive response, would decrease, right? It doesn't serve me to put myself out there and be rejected over and over again.
Right.
So they talked about how their own desire would decrease as a result. And I think the sad part is it wasn't just their desire. It was, they're questioning the relationship. Does she even want to be with me? Did I do something? Am I a bad person or like a flawed person beyond the fact that we're all like no one's perfect, but kind of like really going deep inside themselves. So that was a really common reason that men gave for their decreased desire or not being interested anymore. And it's interesting, a point that I feel often like now in the clinical setting is, when things have kind of the pendulum has swung in that direction, is a female partner kind of reaching out and saying, "What's going on? I'm interested. Like I thought you would want this. Like I
Right.
thought you've always wanted this, and now my desire's high, and you're not there anymore." And having to work to kind of realign things and work through some of that hurt, because it's not so simple, right? If men just wanted sex, the second that she's interested again after whatever lull might have happened in the relationship, he'd be right there.
That's right.
But what I see over and over again is that's a pretty far stretch for a lot of couples.
Right. Right. I noticed in one of the YouTube videos I was looking at, you were talking to someone and she explained how she made plans to go to the you might remember this, the Indiana Dunes, and she asked her guy to, you know, get a tent, and that maybe while they were there they could get, physical and intimate and everything while they're at the dunes, and he said no, he didn't want to do that. And she was surprised a little bit because she was kind of taken back, like, I thought you would want to do that. You know what I'm saying? And she started
Hmm.
kind of wondering, are you okay? And, just immediately her thoughts went to, there's got to be something wrong. And I was also thinking
Exactly.
that oftentimes women will go to, well, what's wrong with him? Is he gay? Or, you know what I'm saying? Is he, or they may think, well, is he seeing somebody else or whatever? So I wanted to talk about what
Absolutely.
you know about women's responses when, men are not interested in sex. What do women tend to think, when this happens? Have you been
Yeah,
able?
well, and kind of, dovetailing off we were talking before, is because these ideas that men should want sex all the time are so socially ingrained.
Yes.
When women get into relationships with men, that is the assumption that he's going to have a high sex drive and it's probably going to be higher than mine.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just kind of briefly take a little side note and say what we know from the research. I've conducted a study myself, and there's a few other similar studies that show similar findings. Is when men and women are in relationships with one another, about a third of the time the man has higher desire, about a third of the time it's about the same, and about a third of the time the woman has the higher desire.
Right.
So there's a lot of variation that happens in relationships, but we still hold the idea that men have higher desire than women. And so when that doesn't happen, and this can be either on a more global scale, like sometimes women say, I've got higher desire than my male partner all the time, or maybe it's a bit more of like the ebbs and flows, or even like a one or two off where it's like, well, I thought we would want to have sex. Like, why don't you want to? Women tend to take it quite personally. They do question their desirability. Does he still want me? Is he still attracted to me? Does he still have feelings for me? Is there something else going on? Because again, it just goes so far out
Yes.
of this norm and stereotype that we have. Part of the reason I think it's so important for us to be talking about this is to give more space for men to be able to express the full range and authenticity of their sexuality. But I think it's also important for women to kind of realize, the science, like the sex science shows, there's a good chance that you could end up with a male partner who has lower desire than you, and that's completely normal.
Mm-hmm.
Every couple has to figure out how they're going to navigate their sexuality, the frequency of sex, the type of sex they're having. We all have to figure that out. But if we can create space to say, you know what, if women have higher desire and he's not interested, there's a very good chance that's just normal variation. So let's not jump into panic mode here.
Right. Okay.
We all know if something feels off suddenly in our relationship, right? Sometimes there are those red flags. But if this is kind of just a pattern or something that's shown up, let's not necessarily immediately ring the alarm bells. Let's kind of ask, maybe it's possible that we just fall into kind of this spectrum versus the stereotype that I thought men and women experience when they got into relationships with one another.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. Okay. So now I'll switch gears a little bit because I want to find out what were some of the things that men reported that helped them or motivated them towards sex.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked because, again, I think that's such a key part here, right? It's not just when men aren't in the mood, but also what helps men get in the mood and confronting, is it that simple? Like, is it just,
Letting them know you want to.
snap
Right.
your fingers and,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. Um, so, one of the things that stood out more than anything, across the board was men almost always talked about how important it was for them to feel desired by their female partner.
Mm.
So one of the things, that we learn is that men are the ones to be the pursuer in heterosexual or mixed sex relationships, that they are the ones who are going to, flirt, that they're going to be the ones to offer compliments, that they're going to be the ones to show up with flowers on a date or give chocolates on Valentine's Day. I still kind of put the whole proposal and marriage kind of in that same category, right? They're the ones giving, they're the ones putting themselves out there a bit. And the women get to feel pretty, they get to feel doted on, they get to feel sexy, they get to have all these kind of compliments. And what we know from the research, and I mentioned before, like I've studied women's sexual desire as well, that's a key component for women for their sexual desire, to feel that their male partner or their,
Right.
their
D- d-
boyfriend or their husband wants to have sex with them, that they're sexually drawn to them.
Yes.
And when women have a partner, then they feel that he's not doing that, if he's not doting on her in that way, they talk about that being a real libido killer, that it
Yeah.
kind of doesn't make them feel so sexy if he's not expressing his want for her. It struck me as really interesting that men talk so regularly and so reliably about the importance of feeling desired. And also, because again of these social norms, that a lot of female partners or like their girls or their girlfriends and wives weren't doing that
Yeah.
because it wasn't necessarily considered what you do. Like a lot of women don't necessarily think of how much they are offering compliments, right? It's like, oh, you look so handsome today. You look so sexy today. Are some women doing it? Of course. But the men that I've been interviewing and the men who participate in my research regularly say that they're not getting it nearly as much as they might like.
Mm-hmm.
And when they do get it, man, does it make them feel good. And
Right.
it increases their sexual desire. It increases their self-esteem, their overall interest in having sex. So this was kind of, men talked about like how would they feel desired. From the most basic, easy to implement things like just like receiving compliments. They talked about, physical touch. If
Mm-hmm.
they're, the partner would just kind of come up and give them a little kiss out of the blue, give them a little like, flirtatious smack on the butt,
Yeah.
um, a massage, just even sit on the same like couch and just kind of snuggle into them. Just those things. It didn't necessarily mean that sex was imminent. It didn't necessarily mean that sex was being initiated, but just romantic gestures, physical touch that was initiated by her. Men talked about how it just made them feel so good and something that they just did not get enough of in the relationship. And then the most, explicit in your face example of feeling desired was when, their wives or girlfriends would actually initiate sex when she was like, I'm horny, I'm feeling it, I'm feeling you, you are turning me on, and I want to pursue sexual activity with you. Men said again, this was rare in these mixed sex relationships. It was more often the onus was on their shoulders to initiate. And there's some questions that go along with it. Do you want this as much as I do? Are you as into this as I am? Men really talked about how such a big part of their desire was making sure that their female partner was into it, that she was excited, that she was turned on. And so when she took the lead role in any way, from something a little bit more subtle, like a compliment or flirting, to something more explicit, like initiating sex, he just felt desired, he felt wanted, and he talked about that being, men generally talked about that being such a key and often overlooked part of their sexual desire and their sexuality in general.
Okay. Yeah. And that kind of brings me to, when we talk about the mismatched sex drive and, being turned down, rejected, and all of this kind of stuff. So, what can you share with men and women about, navigating touch that not necessarily means that either of them wants to have sex? How can they kind of uh, get in their heads that maybe they just want to ease in and cuddle or do whatever without either of
Mm-hmm.
them necessarily definitely thinking that, okay, this means we have to have sex. So what's your suggestion
Yeah.
for couples, because with the
Mm-hmm.
mismatched sex drive, maybe one of them doesn't, but they do want to be held, they do want to be intimate and close.
Yeah, it's such a great question because I think so many of us are navigating that. It's a very common and a very unfortunate pattern, I think, that shows up with in a lot of relationships where there is a mismatch of desire, and no one likes disappointing their partner. And, it's hard to hear no if you want sex and your partner doesn't, but it's also hard to say no, right? There's a lot of, people who feel that they've got lower desire in a relationship and they feel guilty when they say no. They feel like
Yeah.
they're disappointing their partner. So it's not easy on either end. Um, One of the most common, and I said like unfortunate patterns, is that in order to avoid giving the wrong impression, we can easily start pulling away. Like, I don't want to make out with you because if making out makes you think that we're about to have sex and I don't know if I want to have sex,
Right.
then maybe I won't make out with you. And, if touching your hand maybe leads into kissing and might lead into sex, and I don't know that I want to go down that road and have sex, and maybe I won't even touch your hand. And maybe even if I give you that glance, you can kind of see how this
Yeah.
can kind of just continue rolling.
Right.
And, there's a lot of people who really start pulling away, not wanting to give the wrong idea, not wanting to kind of come on too strong. Like, it happens on both ends. Um,
Right.
and I think one of the most important things for relationships is to maintain some level of that intimacy, whether or not you're having sex, a couple times a week, once a month, less. Like, we want to have some passion, some intimacy, some affection, and being able to just kind of talk that out and explicitly say, you know what, I just want to kiss tonight. Is that okay? I don't know if I want to have sex yet, but I'm pulling away from kissing you or touching you or even sitting on the same couch with you because I don't want to give you the wrong idea. I think having that conversation as explicitly as possible.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, communication is found through basically every study that's ever been
Oh
done around
gosh,
sexual
yes.
satisfaction to be
Yes.
like a key factor, right? Like, we need to talk. Our partners
Yes.
aren't mind readers. We're not mind readers. We don't know. If you go in for a kiss, sometimes someone might perceive that as, ooh, you're initiating sex.
Yeah.
You might feel like, oh, I just wanted to give you a peck and now I'm going to go, continue and I've got to return some emails.
Right.
Um, So, creating some space to say, what if, it depends on the person. Sometimes people like being a little bit more structured. What if Monday to Friday, if we sit on the same couch or if we cuddle or we kiss, it's not going anywhere because during the week I'm too tired to have sex. But if I come over and give you a kiss on a Saturday morning, you can assume that that's like me maybe interested in seeing where things go.
So if they just
Always, of
kind of,
course, with the
yeah,
ability to say no at any time.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
But, putting some parameters around it to make sure that we're still carving out time. We talk about the most passionate and exciting parts of our sex life. A lot of people refer back to those early dating stages where it was like unknown, like where is this going to go? Can we even? Maybe we can only hold hands because, if we're thinking back to being teenagers, like maybe other people are around or we're at our parents' house. Like there's a lot to be said for that part of a relationship where sex isn't necessarily part of the menu or what's on the menu.
right.
Um, so I'm very a big advocate for encouraging couples to find time to, do all the other things other than what we might constitute as sex. Um, but being clear with our partner about where our boundary is. And, if we can have that conversation before it even
Yeah,
starts, then it leads to less miscommunication and frustration because
right.
everyone's on the same
They
page.
know what to expect. Yes, exactly. And you talked a little bit about the fact that men actually, they like the fact of being feeling like they're desired from their female, counterpart, and they liked when she, touches his butt or whatever, just, those kinds of things. So, what can you say to women? Because maybe they're just, like you said earlier, they're not used to doing this, or maybe they've always thought that that was inappropriate for women to do. But we find that
Hmm.
they need to possibly, warm men up for sex. So, what types of things can you suggest for women to do to men to
Hmm.
warm them up that
Yeah,
they can make the
yeah.
advances and stuff? Yeah.
Great question. So I think there's again a range. Some women are like, oh yeah, of course, I already do that a bit. Maybe I could do it more. Like that's easy peasy. There's some women who, in contrast, say, whoa, I've never actually kind of been in the pursuer role. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's maybe a bit confronting for me. Like what's it like for me to put my sexuality out there? Women who come from more religious backgrounds or more strict backgrounds. Sometimes I'm finding there's a bit of a generational thing. So some of my clients who are more in their 50s and 60s say like, the gender roles were a lot stronger then. Maybe we're kind of starting to break them as we go here. Um, but, sometimes stepping into that, well, I have a sexuality. I'm not just responding to you, but actually embracing when am I in the mood? Like, do I feel like having sex right now? Like, what would it be like for me to tell my partner that I want to have sex? What would it be like for me to be the one who initiates? That can be very difficult for some women.
Yep.
Um, again, because it goes against the grain, it goes against what we've been taught.
Yes.
Let him come to you.
Right.
This is the exact opposite of that. And so, if that is you, like is anyone listening to this, one, know it's normal, but two, it can be incredibly empowering to give yourself the space to think, am I embracing my own desires or am I mostly or often being receptive to my boyfriend or husband's desires.
Mm-hmm.
What would it be like for me to think of when am I in the mood? What gets me in the mood? To say, whoa, I'm feeling like a little bit of an interest in sex. What's it like for me to actually kind of step over or walk over to my partner and actually start making moves on him and putting out that I'm interested? It can be very erotic. It can be very empowering for women. Because I think it does women a huge disservice to be put into the category of gatekeeper.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a sexy thing to really be doing. I mean, it's okay. I mean, just if someone wants us, then we can be like, oh, that part's nice. But always being the one to be receptive versus acting, it doesn't let us embrace the full part of our sexuality. So yeah, like I said, I'm a huge proponent for women stepping in and kind of saying, could I be more active in our sex life? Could I be more active in the initiation and making my partner feel desired and acting on my own desires instead of waiting for him to make a
Yes.
move?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, and before we start to wrap up, I know that you've got some myths that you share in your book. And I remembered, I think one of the myths even talks about the fact that, the answer to it, I guess, is that, men sometimes feel even if they don't want to have sex and their um, partner wants to, that they'll go ahead and do it, even though they really don't want
Mhm.
to. And when I heard you say some things about men faking an orgasm, even now, I've always heard of women doing that, but you talked about the fact that there's even some occurrences of men faking an orgasm just because they went ahead and did the act and thought, they should just kind of act like this happened. I mean,
Mhm.
can you talk about that? It's really something.
Yeah, I can certainly talk a bit about it. I mean, when it comes to orgasms, like I said, my focus is more on the desire part and whether we decide that we're going to have sex or whether we're interested in having sex. But
Right.
it's not so contained. So it's not just about desire. It feeds into how aroused we are, and how aroused we are feeds into how likely we are to have an orgasm. When we talk about faking orgasms, again, most of us tend to be pretty familiar with that being something that some
Right.
women do sometimes.
Right.
Um, that I don't know, women receive different reasons for doing that, right? Like, I want to make him happy.
Right.
I think that's what it's supposed to sound like because that's what I've seen in porn, and that's not my natural reaction. But maybe I should make it look like that's my natural reaction.
Yeah.
Um, but we don't really talk about as much of men faking orgasms, but it certainly does happen. In my research, what happened more often was that men were talking about, um, you know, faking their interest in having sex because they didn't want to admit that they weren't in the mood. So they
Yeah.
might still have sex
Yes, that was it.
because they didn't want to disappoint their partner, or they didn't want to, like I said kind of earlier, like almost disappoint themselves. Like, it's like, I shouldn't say no, or if I say no this time, what if she says no the next time? Like,
Right.
there's kind of this, like, always, like, not always, but sometimes a calculated response, and it was less about how they truly felt and more how they felt like they should act. And I think what is really important about that is it's kind of addressing that if we're using how often men are having sex and we talk about frequency and behaviors, we're not always getting at the heart of the matter in terms of the psychology or what's happening for men internally. So I might not feel like I'm in the mood, but I'm going to kind of talk myself into it, or I'm going to kind of,
Right.
even pursue sexual activity because I know that's what my wife expects. But it's not necessarily always an authentic reflection of how they're feeling
It's
on the
not.
inside.
Yeah.
So I think that just also really points to the need to kind of be a little bit more curious. Just because, a partner is having sex, just because they are initiating sex, I think it's worth kind of questioning, like, what gets you a little bit more turned on? What gets you a little bit less? Has your desire fluctuated at all? One thing that also showed up, I realize we haven't really talked about yet, is aging and different stages of life and
Yes.
adulthood.
Yes.
I think a lot of the stereotypes that we really hold about men's desire being this high, constant, and wavering, anytime, any place, etc., comes from these ideas of what sex looks like for many, again, not necessarily all men as teenagers when hormones are rampant, and but a lot of the men in my research, and again a lot of the men in my clinical practice, tend to kind of be in their mid to late 20s, in their 30s, in their 40s, 50s, and beyond. And they'll talk about, like, yeah, that stereotype might have fit for me like a few decades
Back
ago,
then,
or
yes.
even like 10 years ago. But it's definitely no longer the situation now that my hormones have kind of like found like a nice equilibrium. And maybe now that, like, I've got a couple kids, or I'm in a longer term relationship, or like
Right.
I've got mounting bills to pay, like I got to get up in the morning and get to work, and there's this big meeting, and staying up and having sex tonight, just like a push comes to shove, I got to get some,
Sleep.
like,
Yeah.
I've got to get some rest so I can like
Right.
perform tomorrow, like at work, not like perform
Yep.
right now in the bedroom. So,
Yep.
um, so yeah, I think, um, yeah, kind of talking about where the stereotype exists and how, I mean, most men aren't teenagers, right?
Yes.
Population wise.
Right.
So we're kind of holding the standard of like, okay, so you're there for a few years, but what happens after? What happens when you're an adult? What happens when all these other things start piling
That's
on?
right.
So,
That's right.
um,
That's right.
mhm,
All right.
mhm.
Well, this has been very, very interesting. So, if you'll tell the listening audience your book again, and then how they can obtain the book, and also how they can hear more from you, because you have a website and maybe some social media that they can reach out to you on. Or so, why don't you let
Yeah,
the
for
listeners know?
sure. Okay. So my name is Sarah Hunter Murray. My book is called Not Always in the Mood, The New
Hmm.
Science of Men, Sex, and Relationships. And you can buy it online at, Amazon, Chapters, indie stores, anywhere that you buy your books. And if you want any more information about me, I'm on Twitter at Sex Dr. Sarah, and my website is sarahhuntermurray.com. I write for Psychology Today. All my blogs are up there. A bit more information about me and a bit more information about my book is there as well.
Outstanding. Outstanding. Thank you so much, Sarah, for coming on the show. It has been, man, very enlightening, very interesting. And I've certainly learned a lot. I hope my audience has too. So
Oh,
thank you.
good. Well, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
Yes. And listeners, thank you for listening to the Lovers Lounge podcast, where we talk to experts like Sarah and other guests on topics related to love, relationships, and sex. I'm your host, Tina Love. And until next time, peace. And of course, don't you forget, love.